Saturn, the Grim Reaper, Old Father Time, the Dark Lord of limits, materiality, denial, and structure. At the boundary of the traditional cosmos, he patrols the gateway to the divine realm. But is he really a she? Could Saturn, usually seen as a masculine entity, actually be feminine? There's an intriguing claim in one of the most influential texts of Hellenistic astrology that this really is the case. In this episode of World Astrology Report, I'm going to show you what that text is and then explain why the idea that Saturn could be feminine actually makes a lot of sense. So join me for another journey into the past to understand the present and the future. I got the idea for this episode from someone who asked me a question on this very subject at the end of a talk I recently gave for Nightlight Astrology. Can't remember your name, but if you're watching, thanks for the inspiration. In this episode, I'm going to be drawing heavily on a couple of articles on this subject published by the astrologer Charlie Obert on his blog, Student of Astrology, which I've linked in the description below. Chris Brennan also has a typically thorough episode of the Astrology podcast on this subject, which I'll also draw on here, so do check that out if you want to dive into this. Again, the link is below. Now, the reference to Saturn as feminine appears in the Carmen Astrologicum, an instructional poem written by Dorotheus of Sidon, an extremely influential Hellenistic astrologer. Dorotheus says this: the feminine planets are Saturn, Venus, and the Moon. The masculine ones are the Sun, Jupiter, and Mars. There's no ambiguity there. Dorotheus says clearly that Saturn is a feminine planet. But this is the only description of Saturn as feminine in the Hellenistic astrological tradition, at least that we're aware of. Other authors all say that Saturn is masculine, and the god that the planet is named for is mythologically held to be just that, a god, not a goddess. In the original Greco-Roman myths, Saturn, or Kronos, was the god of time. He castrated his father Uranus and devoured his own children, lest they overthrow him as ruler of the Titans. He's always described and depicted as masculine, but of the astrological Saturn, Dorotheus says otherwise. What's going on? Chris Brennan points out that this could just be a translation error, because we're looking at the English translation of an Arabic translation of a Persian translation of a text that was originally written in Greek. And there are other errors in the text. Also, elsewhere in the text, Dorotheus says that the Sun and Saturn signify older brothers, which would suggest that Saturn is masculine. But maybe this part was the error and Dorotheus really does mean that Saturn is feminine. Now, Dorotheus is one of the earlier Hellenistic authors. Could it be that there really was an early astrological tradition of Saturn being considered feminine, which was later forgotten or changed, perhaps for patriarchal reasons? Well, we just don't know. But what is interesting is that there are some intriguing reasons, both astrological and metaphysical, for why it actually makes a lot of sense for Saturn to be feminine. If you're enjoying this episode so far, then please do me a favor and hit that like button, and do subscribe to the channel if you want to make sure to catch future episodes of World Astrology Report. Something that enchants a lot of people who study the system of Hellenistic astrology is its elegance. There are all sorts of beautiful symmetries in the way it's arranged. For example, the two luminaries, the Sun and the Moon, rule Leo and Cancer, and the other 5 planets rule 2 signs each, spreading out symmetrically from those signs until we reach the 2 signs ruled by Saturn. This is one reason why Hellenistic-style astrologers are so resistant to letting the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, rule signs too. But there's a glaring exception to the symmetry in the standard Hellenistic system. According to most authors, the masculine planets are the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and the feminine planets are the Moon and Venus. And Mercury is considered to be kind of hermaphrodite who goes both ways. But that's obviously imbalanced because we have 4 masculine planets and just 2 feminine ones. But is the cosmos really such a boys' club? After all, we have 2 major lights in the sky, the Sun and the Moon. They were traditionally considered to be masculine and feminine respectively, and what's clear is that they exist in exquisite balance with each other, at least from our perspective. The sun's diameter is 400 times that of the moon, but the moon is 400 times closer to the Earth, and so the two bodies appear to be almost precisely the same size in the sky. This is a cosmic miracle that means we experience perfect solar eclipses here on Earth, something I explored in this video. And so it would be far more elegant to make Saturn feminine, which would give us 3 masculine planets, 3 feminine planets, and Mercury. But there's more. As Charlie Obert suggests, if we use Dorotheus' scheme, we can line up the 3 planets of each gender and see an interesting progression through 3 ages of a human being's life. Take the masculine planets. Mars would signify the young man, the Sun, the father, and Jupiter, the old man. Feminine planets would then have Venus as the young woman, the Moon as the mother, and Saturn as the old woman. Or, to put it in line with certain ideas about the goddess, we have the trinity of maiden, mother, and crone. This would once again produce a far more elegant astrological system. But there's much about the nature of Saturn itself to suggest that old father time is in fact old mother time. Saturn patrolled the boundary of the traditional cosmos. It was the furthermost known planet from the Sun. And so just as Saturn's sign of Aquarius opposes the Sun's sign of Leo, Saturn stands in opposition to the Sun. There would be a certain elegance to the 2 planets being of opposite gender. But there's something else here about Saturn at the boundary of the cosmos. And here I'm going to draw on the archetypal astrologer Ren Butler's excellent book, Pathways to Wholeness. In many mystical traditions, the universal mind, the absolute, or God, if you like, exists as a kind of timeless, undifferentiated consciousness, but it yearns to experience beings and worlds different from itself. And so it splits itself into separate, distinct entities, each of which is a part of that original divinity. Saturn represents this dividing principle, one that results in the myriad entities that we see in the world, each falsely convinced of its own distinct nature. To quote Butler on Saturn, it is the force of contraction that causes the many separate units of awareness in the material world to forget who they really are. Now think of the process of birth. Butler says, in a healthy womb, the fetus's awareness is still undifferentiated from that of the entire universe. As the uterine walls begin to contract, its awareness is compressed into the boundaries of its own body. This process of contraction, of being placed under great pressure, is one we can associate with Saturn. And that's sometimes how Saturn transits feel. We can feel crushed under the pressure of duty and responsibility, or the burdens of life, with seemingly nowhere to escape. In these kinds of experience, we're reminded of the terror of birth, something each of us holds as an unconscious memory. And so, just as a pregnant woman is the container of a nascent person, so Saturn is the container of that which lies within our material cosmos. And with this in mind, it makes a lot of sense that Saturn might be feminine. So while the jury is still out, it seems quite possible that here in astrology, we have an erased feminine presence that could be poised to return. I've seen quite a few traditional astrologers adopt a conception of Saturn as feminine, and perhaps that might spread. But why might it happen now? The idea that a feminine presence in astrology may have been covered up finds an interesting counterpart in Christianity. We have the Holy Trinity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but there's a debate within Christianity over the gender of the Holy Spirit. Some churches say it's masculine, but others consider it to be feminine and equate it with the principle of wisdom, or Sophia. Wisdom is, I think, something we commonly associate with Saturn. Catholicism retains a strong feminine presence in its theology in the person of Mary, Mother of Christ, but in the Protestant faiths, she was erased as an object of worship. It's interesting to note that Protestantism, with its absent feminine, emerged into the world around the same time as the scientific method, which tends to objectify the world. But I think there are good astrological reasons for thinking that divine feminine is returning. In my recent New Age 2026 series, I went deep into the themes of the current Pluto-Neptune cycle, which began with 3 conjunctions of those planets in 1891 and 1892. Now, in general, Pluto-Neptune has to do with faith and our deepest and most fundamental beliefs about the world. And the themes that were swirling around the zeitgeist at the time of those conjunctions in the late 19th century reflect those themes that will unfold over the course of the 500-year cycle of those planets, which will take us to the next conjunctions in 2385. And something I didn't get into in New Age 2026 is how the emerging first wave feminism was one of the major themes of that period. For example, the women's suffrage movement, which fought to win women the right to vote and stand for public office, was really getting going in that period. And the Oxford English Dictionary dates the very first use of the term feminism in English to 1895. Those conjunctions and the themes activated around that time showed what was to come. And lo and behold, over the course of the 20th century and up to today, we have indeed seen a complete transformation of women's rights and roles in society around the world. What's more, the feminist movement was supercharged in the 1960s, which was a time of great radicalism on many fronts. At that time, there was a powerful and radicalizing conjunction of Uranus and Pluto in Virgo, the sign of the maiden or the sovereign woman. And Pluto and Uranus are getting close to a powerful and harmonious trine aspect, which will be reaching perfection in the years 2026 to 2028. This suggests to me that the process has begun in the 1960s around the empowering of the sovereign woman will be well in evidence at that time. So we've obviously seen huge changes around femininity in the secular world. But in the 1890s, there was also arguably a turn towards the feminine in spirituality as well. In this episode of the New Age 2026 series, I noted the emergence of the Theosophical Society around the time of those conjunctions. The society was, of course, founded by a woman, Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, HPB, and was later led by her disciple, Annie Besant. I think that the later emergence in the 20th century of the New Age movement, and indeed the modern spiritual but not religious tendency, was both signified and seeded by what was unleashed by Theosophy at that time. And I think that the centrality of women in Theosophy also signified where things were going to go. To this day, in many parts of the world, women are much more open to spirituality than men are, and are leading the way in terms of the adoption of new beliefs and practices. This is true in astrology, yoga, magic, and many other areas. So it seems that the divine feminine may well be reawakening within spiritual and cultural systems. Could an awakening to Saturn's feminine nature be part of that process? Perhaps it might. Personally, I'm not sure if I'm ready to go all in on Saturn as feminine quite yet, given that so much of the astrological and metaphysical tradition holds the planet to be a masculine energy, but I'm certainly open to it, and I think it's worth seriously considering. That's it for this episode. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.